I'm Kate Fuller, and I'm an extension economist and assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics at Montana State University, and I'm going to be talking about cropland and grazing leases. To give you an overview of what we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about why we lease land in the first place, some tips on what to include in a good written lease, different types of leases, considerations for farms versus ranches and grazing land, and then places that you can go to get more information on lease rates that you can use in your negotiation. So first we're going to start with why we lease land to begin with. That depends on which side of the table you're on, so whether you're a tenant or a landlord. If you're a tenant, you might not wish to lease land, you might rather own it. But there are a variety of reasons why that isn't the case for everyone. So if you don't own land, particularly if you're a young or beginning farmer, you're not alone. There was a paper this back in 2016 that looked at that specifically. And a lot of people cite land access as their most significant barrier to entry into farming. One of the reasons why that is the case is that land values have gone up over time. So the graph at the bottom of the page will pay attention to the yellow line because that's inflation adjusted. You can see that going back to 1967, the average farmland real estate value in the U.S. was just under $1,000. And now, or last year in 2017, it was about $2,700. For Montana, this looks a little bit different. Our land is generally less productive on the whole, which makes it of lower value. So our average real estate value is about $1,000 an acre. Landowners, on the other side, might have a more diverse list of reasons for wanting to lease out land. So one reason is that they have land from their family, either that they've owned and want to pass on but aren't quite ready to do that yet. They want to hang on to it for some reason. Other people see land as an investment, and there are actually some investment firms that buy land, lease it out, and use the lease payment as an annual return on that investment. Other people have land, maybe it's family land, maybe it's not, and they just want someone to take care of it, so they lease it out basically to get the caretaking done. Other people would like someone to cover the property taxes that they have to pay on that land. And on that same, in that same vein, property taxes are influenced heavily by if the land is classified as agricultural. So they're quite a bit lower if the land is agricultural land for tax purposes, and that's a lot easier to show if you have someone actively farming or ranching that land. Other people would like to stay involved in agriculture, but maybe not as much as they once were. So in the United States, the farming population is getting older, and there are folks that would like to stay peripherally involved in their operation, but maybe wouldn't like to make some of the day-to-day decisions. So they might lease their land out, but want a little bit more of a say of how it's farmed or ranched. How does this look across the United States? You can see that in general, places with higher value real estate or higher value farmland real estate have a higher percentage of rented land. So those darker colors, that refers to a higher percentage of rented land versus owned. So California, some areas in the Midwest, Montana, we have a lot of land in sort of the 20 to 50% rented range. The one county that's different is Sanders County. That county has 60% or more of land that is rented out, or farmland that's rented out. All right, so we're going to go through some information on what to include in a lease, and we're going to do this relatively briefly. And the reason we're going to do it briefly is because I'm not a lawyer. A lot of the considerations of things that you want to include in a lease are law related. So we have some good resources on our website. That website is aglease.msuextension.org. We have a Mont guide. It's called Grazing Leases. It goes over a lot of the more legally considerations in writing up a lease. And even if you don't have grazing land, I'd encourage you to take a look at that because it covers topics that are applicable to non-grazing land as well. We also have some videos from a professor in our department, Terry Shaplow, who is a lawyer, and he teaches some ag law classes. And he goes over some lease law considerations, and I think that's been pretty helpful to a lot of people. So the gist, though, in thinking about this, is that a lease is a contract. It should be a written contract, and it transfers certain property rights for a certain period of time. So if you write the lease, a lot of people have a handshake lease. We always encourage those people to try to get it in writing if they can. And so it should be in writing, and it should have clear terms describing who is responsible for what and when. Now, one thing that you might want to think about is adding some contingencies for unexpected circumstances. So things like death. So in the event that a landlord or tenant dies during the course of a lease, how you're going to handle that. But also more related to natural disasters. So things like fire and flooding. If you have a severe drought and you need to move animals, how you're going to handle that. Those are all situations that are pretty awful, but if you have a plan in advance, that can really help make it a less awful situation when it actually comes to pass. Now, if you're using a form lease, so basically a lease that consists of filling out a form that you find online, and there are quite a few of these out there, you're going to want to check it carefully. So check to make sure that it includes everything that you want on there, and you can edit it to the extent that you see fit. I'll show you one place where you can find some of those forms later on. Now, if things do go wrong and you end up going to court, there are some resources that can be useful to you in maybe avoiding actually ending up in court. So one of those is mediation, and the Montana Department of Agriculture offers this service. It's something that you can use, and it costs it costs less than sort of the going rate for mediation service, and it can help you avoid going to court. So if you just Google Montana Department of Ag mediation, this page should come up. You can also find a link to it on our Ag Lease website. All right, so now we're going to spend a few minutes talking about different types of leases. So when we talk about types of leases, there are two general categories. One is fixed and the other is variable. So fixed cash lease is going to be in per acre, per head, per pair, per animal unit or animal unit month terms. And it's going to be just what it sounds like, a fixed rate for the duration of the lease. Most leases in Montana are fixed cash leases. We also have variable rate leases, and these are leases that can look a number of different ways, but the thing that they have in common is that the rate that's paid changes over time. And if you're using a variable rate lease, the landlord is going to share in some of the price or production risk, and that'll come up in a minute. So there are advantages and disadvantages to each of these types of different leases. So for fixed cash, the big advantage is that these are very simple. So it's a set rate. You don't have to think about recalculating it using a formula every year. Um, they're also very common, which means that you can get statistics on what those averages look like, or you could potentially ask your neighbor. They probably have the same type of lease, what they're getting, and use that information in your negotiation. They're also predictable, which can be a big benefit if you are on a fixed income and you need some certain amount coming in. Because they're simpler, they imply less decision making for the landowner, so no rate calculation. You don't have as much of a vested interest in what's happening on the land, so you might be more inclined to just step back and receive the payment. But there are disadvantages to this type of lease, to fixed cash leases as well. What the disadvantage is depends on who you are. So if you're a landowner, you don't receive any good year windfall profits. So if prices go up a lot in a given year, you're not going to take part in receiving some of that benefit. In general, they also have a bit of a lower payment compared to share leases. So variable rate leases, the tenant is generally willing to pay a little bit more to have the landlord share in that risk with them. And for tenants, they have all of the yield and or the price risk. So that the big disadvantage is I think for tenants. And talking about flexible arrangements or variable rate arrangements, I'm going to use those terms sort of interchangeably here. Some advantages are that there is reduced production or price risk for the tenant. Both parties are going to benefit in a good year, so the tenant may not benefit as much. That's sort of the cost of sharing some of that risk. There can also be the advantage of more communication, which can be a good thing if your landlord has a lot of experience in the production system that you're working in and has a vested interest in your operation. The disadvantages are that the income for the landowner becomes variable. So again, if you're on a fixed income or you want or need a set payment, this is not the tool for you. There are also self-employment tax considerations. So when I said a couple slides back that in a variable rate lease, the landlord is going to share in the production or price risk, that can imply that you as a landlord need to pay self-employment taxes. So in order to determine whether that's the case, talk with your accountant or maybe the attorney that looks over the lease. They can get you squared away on that. It also can mean more measurement, record keeping, trust, and communication. So if a landlord has a vested interest in what's going on that operation, because they're receiving a payment that's dependent on production or prices, they're probably going to want to know more about what you're doing, what the farm management practices are. They're going to want to talk more. And that can be a good thing, and it can also be a difficult thing if you don't have a great relationship. So let's look at some examples of variable rate leases. The most common of these are share leases, particularly for crops. So crop share leases continue to be pretty common in Montana. And we're just going to look at 4 examples here. The first one is a crop share lease, where a landowner is going to charge a wheat grower a flat percentage of their revenue. And the second example, kind of the same idea, but a little more complex. The landowner is going to charge a CSA producer a percent of their revenue, but they're going to say that percent is determined according to the relative cost contributions of the landlord and the tenant. And we'll talk more about what a contributions approach means in a minute. But essentially it means that the tenant tallies up their costs, the landlord tallies up theirs, they total the costs, and they figure out which party or the percentage that each party is contributing, and they divide the proceeds up accordingly. In the third example of a share lease, a landowner receives a given percent of hay produced for her horses. So very similar to number one, but instead of revenue, we're talking about an in-kind or non-monetary payment. Example 4 is that the tenant pays a landlord a share of the value of gain of calves during their time on summer pasture. And we actually have a tool that helps calculate just that on the MSU Extension Ag Lease website. I'll show you that in a minute. Flex leases are another type of variable rate leases. And they can be set up in a number of different ways. So you can flex on different things, including price, production, revenue, or other. In the example that we're going to look at an example that is flexing on price. So in this example, we've got a base rate that's fixed for the term of the lease, and we're going to adjust that year to year based on current prices relative to historical averages. Now, this is a lot easier if good price data are available. So if you have a crop like wheat or barley, where you can go to USDA NASS, if you look up Quick Stats, that's a really good resource for looking at historical prices. You can establish that historical average and then look at what the current year is looking like relative to that a lot more easily than if you have a crop that is less common. So if you are growing a variety of heirloom tomatoes, for example, NASS doesn't collect specific information on that. So that's going to be harder to set up as a flex lease, or at least as a flex price lease. There are other ways you can set this up as well. Now, a contributions approach, which I talked about a couple slides back, can be fixed or flexible. So in a contributions approach, the tenant is going to calculate their cost contributions, the landlord calculates theirs, and then the estimated proceeds are split between the parties according to their contribution. And you can do this every year for a flexible or variable rate. You can also estimate it in advance for several years for a fixed rate. Now, there are a couple different reasons for using a contributions approach. One is equitability, so each party gets out what they put in. I get a lot of calls asking what a fair rate is, and economists don't really like to use the word fair. We like to use the word equitable, which essentially means just this. So you get out according to what you put in. Now, they can also be useful in negotiation. So even if you end up using a fixed cash lease, going through some of those cost calculations as sort of an exercise with your tenant or with your landlord can be a useful conversation to have. Oftentimes, each party isn't really aware of all of the things that the other party is doing. They can also, this type of approach can also help share risk. So if the rate is variable from year to year, it can help spread that risk between the landlord and the tenant. And in what follows, I'll show a couple tools for helping to calculate a contributions approach, or at least bringing some of that into the negotiation. So before we go into that, though, I'll talk a little bit about considerations for farms versus ranches. So for cropland, there are a number of different considerations, and the first is USDA Farm Program participation. So these are programs like ARC and PLC in the current Farm Bill, as well as conservation programs like CRP acreage. So these are all things that you want to talk about with your landlord and your tenant. Um, so specifically, if you're talking about Farm Bill programs like ARC or PLC, you're going to want to talk about who is going to determine that program, because at least in this last Farm Bill it was fixed for the duration of the program. And then who receives the payment. So particularly if you're looking at a share lease where a landlord and tenant both have vested interest in the production, you're going to want to think about how the payment, if one is received, is split up. Oftentimes it's just according to the share. The other things to consider are long-term improvements. So this is the case for both cropland and pasture land. But essentially, if a landlord is going to put in a costly improvement, whether that's something like, generally don't think about it so much in soil amendments like nitrogen that are applied annually, but something more long-term like lime. Then if that lease transfers, thinking about a way for that tenant to potentially be compensated for doing that. Sort of in that same line is organic conversion and other types of conservation planning and conservation practices. So if a tenant converts land to organic, there is some evidence that landlords can then receive a higher rate for that land. So when they rent it out, they may get a higher rate than they previously did. So if a tenant is going to go through that process, which implies 3 years of producing according to organic practices, but not receiving any of the thrice premiums for organic production, they may want to be compensated in some way for doing that. Other types of long-term conservation plans, things like putting acreage into CRP, should definitely be discussed. But then other things like building up the soil, not selling crop residue. These are things that you can include in a lease and make things a lot clearer between a landlord and a tenant in moving through production year to year. Now, I mentioned some tools for calculating contributions approach to lease rates. The first one of these is the Fair Rent Cropland Calculator. And what this does is it walks you through a series of sort of spreadsheets. So you're going to put together a budget for your operation, and it helps to calculate what your break-even lease payment is as a tenant. So what the amount at which you cannot pay more without losing money on the lease. It also puts together a useful budget of your overall operation. And it can be a useful tool in looking through all of the cost contributions that the tenant makes for the land in the course of the year. It doesn't have the same thing for landlords, so it's really most useful from a tenant perspective. Now, for grazing leases, your big consideration is going to be the stocking rate. So how many animal units are on that pasture and for how long? And I'll talk about resources that you can use to calculate that if you don't know it already in the next slide. Now, the same sorts of notes on long-term improvements are going to apply here. So pasture improvements, if you're seeding the pasture in a way that's going to have multi-year benefits to who's ever on it, you might want to split some of that up between landlord and tenant. Other long-term improvements, particularly fencing, is a huge one. If you're a tenant and you're putting in fencing, you're probably going to either want compensation for doing that or a guarantee that you can be on that land for a pretty long term. Water supply and quality. So particularly what happens if supplied water runs out or if quality goes down to the point where you need to haul water in, who is going to be responsible for that? Also, who is checking on the animals? Sometimes landlords will do that. Sometimes that's purely the tenant's responsibility, but these are things that you're going to want to specify in the lease. And lastly, water or grass failure, so sort of along the same lines as what I mentioned for the water supply. But if you end up in a drought, there's a fire that comes through, there's another natural disaster that causes you to need to move animals off of the pasture or off of the rangeland, how you're going to address that. And these are things that you can write explicitly into the lease. Now there are a number of different resources for estimating the stocking rate for your property. Being from Extension, I always recommend talking to the county extension agent. They can help you do that. You can also talk with your NRCS office. And NRCS offers a pretty nice resource, which is the Web Soil Survey. That's an online tool that can allow you to estimate a good stocking rate. It shows the number of animal units for unfavorable, favorable, and sort of an average year. And generally the recommendation is that you use an unfavorable year so that you don't end up with an overgrazing situation in a bad year. There are also a number of different tools for estimating that on your own. So some resources I would recommend if you're leaning in that direction are NRCS online. So looking up things online from NRCS, EE Extension, and the MSU Department of Animal and Range Sciences has some good information as well. We have a tool on the AgLease, the MSU Extension AgLease website that helps to estimate a pasture lease rate. So this doesn't help you with the stocking rate. You need to come with that already, but it prompts you to enter some information on the calves that are going onto a given piece of property, the amount of time they're going to be on there, the stocking rate, and then the cost contributions of each party. So the cost contributions of the livestock owner and the cost contributions of the landowner. And it essentially tallies these up. It gives you the cost contribution percentages and dollar values for each party. It estimates the total value of gain for animals on that piece of property over the number of months that they are on there, and it divides that between the two parties. Then there's a bunch of information in this MONT guide, the pasture lease calculator MONT guide. It just walks through how to do that essentially. All right, so now we're going to transition into resources that you can use for setting those lease rates. And we're going to do this for our example operation. Now this operation has a bunch of cropland. It doesn't say anything about it being leased, so I'm just going to look at the pasture land here. So this property has 600 acres that they own, and then they have a mix of private and state land. And we haven't talked at all about state land yet, so that's kind of what we're gonna look at next. So state land is in a lot of ways easier to deal with in terms of setting the rate. There are other reasons why it can be more difficult. But in terms of figuring out what the rate that you'll pay on a piece of state land, it's pretty well set. So the state grazing land is calculated as a multiplier set by the land board. That multiplier, I think the latest one was calculated a few years back, but it's still in effect. And then the average weighted price of beef cattle sold in Montana during the previous year. The stocking rates are also set by the state based on some of those soil maps. And then if you want more information about what specific rates are per animal unit month, they are available from the DNRC. The website is given here. In general, state lands, the going rate is roughly half of what the average is for private land. For private land, we have a lot more resources on our website, aglease.msuextension.org, because those rates are a little harder to determine. So one thing that we have on that website is cash rental rates. So we have them for the state, and next I'll show for the county. And these have moved around a lot over time, but in general, they haven't changed all that much from around when we started collecting information for some of them, which was in the 1990s. We do the same thing for cash pasture rates. And I should mention these are from NAS Quick Stats. So these are just an easier to look at way of getting that information. USDA is the entity that actually collects these rates. Pasture rental rates have been increasing slowly since the late 80s, but in Montana at least not all that much after we account for inflation. These are in 2017 dollars, and in the last year that we had this information for, which is actually 2018, that rate ranges from about $23 to $26, depending on what measure you're looking at. So these are animal unit, pair, or per head rental rates. And then if we look at the average in per acre terms, it's $6.30 for 2018. Now, as I mentioned, we can also look at this information by county. So you can use the county lease rate tool. You can choose your county, and then whether you want to look at pasture, irrigated cropland, or non-irrigated cropland. And hay is included in cropland. I sometimes get some questions about that. Now you'll notice for pretty much any county that you look at, some years are missing, and the reason is that NAS did not receive enough responses to report the numbers back to you. So if you get those surveys, make sure you respond to them. In other years, funding wasn't allocated at the federal level. And that's the case for 2018. So we won't be getting per acre lease rates by county for 2018. So if you look from county to county or even from year to year, you'll notice that these lease rates there's a lot of variation in them. And that's a result of a number of different factors. And just a few of them here are time. So we could be looking at a lease that was negotiated 20 years ago and one that was negotiated last year. These are all getting thrown into some of those averages. Productivity is the thing that we think of as being the big driver. So if we're talking about rangeland or pasture, quality and quantity of forage are the big keys. If we're talking about cropland, soil characteristics and precipitation would be the big drivers there. Improvements, so we talked a little bit about that earlier, but for livestock land, fencing, corrals, water, etc. For cropland, maybe some water or irrigation infrastructure as well. Maybe some soil characteristics that have been built up over time. Then we also have some non-agricultural values, and these are more of an issue for real estate values, so sales data rather than than leases. But those underlying real estate values are what drives lease values, so they can end up playing a role here as well. So things like location, proximity to an urban center or a market, recreation values, and in Montana in particular, views. We also have non-market values. These are things that are harder for us as economists to capture, and these include a good tenant relationship. So if you have a good relationship with the person that is taking care of your land, or you think they're doing a really nice job, you might be willing to cut them a break on the rate. Other folks want to keep land in their family, so you might cut your son or daughter a break relative to a person off the street. The Montana Cadastral is also a useful tool for doing some benchmarking, and you can use that to look up the land that you are renting or thinking about. And it gives a lot of useful information, including some stocking rate information. So this is all based on tax values. So they get this information from that web soil survey I mentioned earlier, among other things, I think, but that's the main one. It will also give you an estimate of what the property value is. And you can combine that property value with estimates that are put together from the USDA to estimate rental rate as a percentage of real estate value to sort of benchmark what a reasonable rental rate might be. So over the US, the rental rate as a percentage of real estate value ranges from about 1 to 5%. One thing to keep in mind if you're using the cadastral is that these are tax values, so they may be a little bit on the low side. So you might want to bump this 5% up to something like 6.5%, 7% to get a full idea of what that range might look like in terms of a rental rate. All of these resources are linked on aglease.msuextension.org, so I'd really encourage you to check that website out. And don't hesitate to get in contact with me if you have any questions on any of this stuff. So here's my contact information, and thank you very much for your time.